Right. So we're going into the forbidden topic, the unspeakable. We're going to talk about money. And in the church, there are some stereotypes. There's enough truth in a stereotype to make it a stereotype. The first one is our Pentecostal sisters and brothers. They're known for talking about money all the time. They're the churches that will even pass the plate a couple of times till they reach the target. I think we'd be here a long time. The Baptists give you the facts. They lay it out. This is why, this is what, this is how. They tell you they got it mapped. And then there's the Anglicans. That's not a comfortable topic. We don't talk about those things. And when we give, we normally want to target it to what we want it to go towards. That's called control, but that's another series, another day. But we need to talk about money. And so we're beginning 4 weeks of talking about money. Now today at the first part, you're going to go, how does Ezekiel 37, hold on, we'll get there. I promise you I will insult everyone by the end of it. Now in New Zealand, we've got tussock deserts. You know what I mean? We don't have deserts. I've been in deserts in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, or like in the Mojave in Southeast California. Those are deserts. There's no life. There's no sound. It's deed. Did I say it right? Deed? It's deed. When you're in those places, you can see the heat waves that actually hide objects that are in direct line of sight. When you're in those places, the temperature can vary 25 degrees Celsius, and suddenly 25 degrees Celsius is freezing. You can cook an egg on the boot of your car at the same speed you would cook it in a skillet on your stove. They actually have lots of topographical features, and there are steep ravines where it's almost as dark as night in the middle of the day because the sun is so bright. In fact, in Psalm 23, and it talks about the valley of the shadow of death, this is David picturing going from Jericho, the 6-mile journey, much steep route up. Go on Google, look it up, pretty interesting. And there's these ravines running off these mountains and ridges that head up toward Jerusalem where it is so dark as soon as the sun crosses over to the western side. And then come the spring rains. And when you get the prophets talking about the coming of the rain and there was no cloud, and then you could see a cloud in the distance and it grew, they would understand. In those places when the spring rain comes, it's deafening thunder, lightning storms. And it torrentially pours in dumps. And there can be flash floods in the middle of this country where people drown because it comes out of nowhere. And then, overnight, there's life. And there's actually noise, the sound of life and insects. And you're like, where have you been hiding? And the flowers come out and they're so green. And here's the funny part about desert flowers. They are so fragrant. Life has come out of death. When you're in the Mojave, there are these lake beds. And these lake beds have these tiny shrimp living in them that are absolutely, totally dormant almost the whole year. Because you see, the desert will be that yellowy kind of dirt sand. And then you get to these lake beds, which are at these low places. And it's as fine as castor sugar sand and is that white. And when these torrential rains come and that water pools in those dry lake beds, suddenly these tiny micro shrimp go through their entire life cycle and go dormant again until the next year. Amazing. You get to Ezekiel 37. And if you want to look at it, you can. And I want you'll pick up a couple of things. When you've got Lord with small caps for O-R-D, and you've got God with small caps for O-D, these are two different words that are being translated by our very limited English language for these names. Lord, written that way, is Yahweh, God's most intimate name. And it begins and ends that passage with Yahweh. In the middle, it's Lord, Lord. God with the caps, Adonai. The great, powerful God. And it's this image of, in that desert, these dry bones. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in one of these deserts, but when you come across bones, and you do in those places, there's no one to bury the animals. The bones dry, and what seems like this hard bone becomes like flaked pastry. And it comes off in layers. And that's the image and the language that the Hebrew text is using. These dry bones that is so dry and so dead that there's no life and redemption coming back. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. And then you get this passage which seems like it's just airy-fairy allegory of life coming back to those dry bones. In a practical age, that's absurd. But there's this idea, and what you have to understand with parables is they're always multi-layered. It talks about the people of Israel being regathered. That's the first layer that you can see that the prophecy comes true. Israel did return. But later in the passage, it talks about God's Spirit being put in them and them becoming my people. When Israel returned from Babylon to Israel, to Palestine, the Spirit never returned to the temple. When the secular state of Israel was created, there was no great movement of God in them being a proclamation to the people. In fact, quite often their behaviors today alienate people from the name of God. There's this coming of the Spirit in His people where these dry bones that come back to life become God's people. Now, what you got to be careful of with prophecy and predictions is misapplication. It gets easy to do that. My best, what I think from study, not in my own reasoning heart, is that first there is these people who the Spirit enters. Part of that prediction, that prophecy, is the coming of the church. The grafting of Jew and Gentile. There's no more Jew, no more Gentile. There are God's people, and the Spirit resides in us. And second, the ultimate, that when there is a great spiritual awakening in the secular state of Israel in those last days. But it seems absurd right now for that to be. It seems impossible. But that's the call of God, is to believe that God could take dry, flaking bones and return life. The breath. The Spirit in the Hebrew is actually breath. The Spirit is God's breath being given to the people. Then we get to the Matthew passage. Now that's interesting. I want you to look at the little picture. I got a little pointer here. This is high speed. Can you see the little orangey brown one? That's a goat. Can you see the nice fat round one? That's a sheep. My son sitting here ate half of one of those last night. I can't afford this. Now that's a passage. How many of you have heard this passage multiple times in your life? Right? It's pretty simple. In the Middle East, they keep sheep and goats together right up to the point where they reach the market. Then, brink, 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 brink. But Jesus uses this parable to say, look, this is how God's going to separate them. Not because one is skinny. Somebody's that guy. It's a phone left by itself. That's interesting. Because it's at the Paschal candle, I think Jesus is calling. Maybe I got the prophecy wrong. But Jesus' description in this parable trying to tell us something isn't by how they look. It's by their demonstrated way of life and value system of how they live their lives, of giving themselves away, of stewarding their gifts and living for the kingdom. Did you notice that? Drink, food, coat, visit. None of that's like impressive degree in God stuff. That's the call on God's church, is that we steward those resources. Now, if you have your Bibles open, you're looking at it, there's two significant parables told immediately before this one. The one immediately preceding is stewarding the 10 talents. How are you going to steward the resources that you've been given? Time, money, and people. How am I going to give and live my life? Now, yes, that's money, but it's also a posture of how we live and why we live and what we do. The parable right before that, which helps us get the full context. Hey, when Jesus tells 3 stories in a row, pay attention. In a Hebrew context, if they told a story, then they told a second, that's really important. But then you tell a third, that's like write this stuff down. He tells the story of the 10 virgins. Now, we often use that passage to teach, hey, if you're one of those bridesmaids that doesn't keep their lamp trimmed and lit and ready to go, you're not ready when Jesus comes back. Fair enough, that's not wrong to exegete that from the scripture. What's missing, though, is understanding that the Jewish mind would have instantly gone to the context of this when it happened. You remember Jewish weddings were a week long, right? Jesus on like day 5 made more wine. We'll just stay there a minute. They would have thought about how excited the bridesmaids were. Is that if you're a bridesmaid, you're excited for the coming of the bridegroom for the bride. Who's Christ's bride? The church. And that there's an excitement and an anticipation. And of course you would have your lamp ready. Of course you would, because you're excited. I've done a wedding or two in my life. The guys all show up having slept 10 hours. They lay down, alarm goes off, they get up. That's how we work. The hens have been up clucking the whole night. They're putting on extra layers of makeup because they're looking like death warmed over without it. You see, the Jewish people would have gotten that. They would have understood that God's people are excited about God's things. In our culture, we say, follow your dreams. What do you love? Go do that. So our emotions lead us and our action follows. But that's not exactly what God says. You see, giving that's need-based is in your windscreen today and in the rear view tomorrow. When Suzanne and I left Wellington to go to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, we raised money overnight because the BBC and Sky, etc., New Orleans was on your screen every day. But about 18 months later, we started having an erosion of support. Why? Because social media brings the next and 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 the next. And you hit like and you share and you maybe go to the give a little and you pop $20 in there. But that's a one-off. You've done your bit and you move on. That is giving by need. That is trying to motivate people emotionally to give by how they are responding to emotion. But you can't sustain emotion. And there's always more need. This here is a picture of a missionary who has gone and lived with the people her whole life. She's gone and stayed. And there would have been plenty of times, if you don't think so, go talk to Ann and Anthony, when it was like, enough of this, I want to go home, but I'm called here and I'm staying. Suzanne and I have this friend, Anna, who's from England. She has spent 45 years in southeast Spain. Now you think, southeast Spain, not bad, Majorca, etc. Actually, Suzanne has been there. I haven't. You see the pictures and I'm like, seriously? She went there as a missionary because she was called. When she retired 5 years ago, she stayed because she then loved those people after investing so much, so long. In our culture, it says your emotions will bring along your will to act. God's word. I want you to notice that verse 21 in Matthew 6. Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Not where your heart is, your treasure will be. Where your treasure is, where you've decided to act and live and place yourself, where you have actually taken control of your emotions and done the will of what you know is right, your heart's going to follow it. It's actually the opposite. That's a very upside down way of thinking and living. Where your treasure lives, your heart will live there too. What you have chosen to spend yourself on, what you have chosen to spend your time and your emotional energy and your gifts and, yes, your money. The upside down kingdom. Because in our society today, driven by emotion, the train is reversed. Your emotions are tossed by every wave. I'm excited about God, I'm not excited about God. I'm excited about this cause, I'm not excited about this cause. I just want to worry about me right now, and I'm not going to think outside of myself. It's the theology of scarcity. The theology of scarcity says there's never enough. It's actually a theology of fear. There's not enough money. There's not enough time. I don't have the gifts. They'll make fun of me. If I do that, then I won't have any left for me. I want to propose something I got from John Wesley. The theology of enough. Now, this is West London stage production of Scrooge. That's the redeemed Scrooge. Charles Dickens, one of the great writers and initiators of the conscience of Great Britain to think about the poor. Oliver, Scrooge, Christmas Carol, etc. You had this person that in the hyperbole was the miserly theology of scarcity, Ebenezer, who has these epiphanies from God in his sleep, but awakes transformed to the theology of enough. It didn't mean he gave everything away and became poor. It meant he lived on enough and shared with everybody he could that he had relationship with to care for them for the rest of his future. Go back and look at his words about Tiny Tim and how he was going to care for them. He willed himself to act on what he knew was right, and his heart for these people followed. What would it look like in our world? Maybe you got a job opportunity to go to Auckland, but you turned it down because your treasure was sitting on your left and your right. Your treasure went back to that room back there. Your treasure are the souls that are going to be impacted in the Olive Branch through this post-COVID food bank we're starting. Your treasure is the teens that are at all of these colleges and high schools around us who are yet to know Him. Have you seen how our church is becoming the UN? We're the United Nations of people. And all of these migrants in this transforming suburb we live in, maybe we make choices based on our call and our love of God and our commitment, and we will ourselves to action in a way that defies the theology of scarcity. This is one of my heroes, John Wesley. He started as an Anglican priest, pastor, an evangelist, 18th century. He went on to be author of many books, theological and other ecclesiological books. And he was a professor in Oxford at Christ Church College, our direct heritage here, and Lincoln College. When he was a young man and he first began, He was living on £23 a day. In London, that would get us maybe 4 coffees and no biscuits with a couple coins left over. Now, worth a lot more then. They didn't have the inflation we have now. But by the time he was old, he was earning over £100 a year from all of his writings and publications and such. But here's the amazing thing, from whom I got the phrase, the theology of enough. As a young man, he decided, I can support me and my family on £23 a year. He didn't live and starve. He lived to be quite old. He stayed healthy. But he figured, I've got enough. And anything else God gives me, I will use for the kingdom. So he used over £80 a year, which was an extraordinary amount of money, all going to the kingdom, and they continued to live on £23 a year. Wesley also went on to say, the last part of the soul converted is the purse. Now, my journey of the theology of enough is still in process. Confession. Second confession, I still like BMWs. Ich liebe auf Deutschland 4 Jahre. I lived in Germany, in Bavaria, for 4 years. When I wrecked my car, I needed to get a car. I'm in Bavaria. Let's go domestic. So what's domestic to Bavaria? Mercedes, Audi, and the ultimate driving machine. You only have to drive a BMW once and you understand that phrase. Oh, in heaven, they're all BMWs. I still like a nice wine. I can walk into a clothing store, as my wife can testify. Now, women, you may not know this. Men don't know this. Well, I don't know. We don't wear ties as much anymore. But you walk into a store, they don't show you the prices on any ties in any store ever, anywhere. Paris, London, New York, L.A., or Christchurch. My taste will go to the most expensive tie every time. We're still in penance on this. But one of the things we did is we determined that we were going to worship God with our first fruits, and that's how we wanted to live. And then we wanted to worship our life with how we lived and what we did, and obviously you're thinking this. But it got much closer to home into how we were going to treat and care for those right in front of us. Before we were married, I had Brian as a guardian parent. Imagine me, 30 years old with a 14-year-old. That's a scary thought. But that actually led to later Adam, who's been grafted into our family. And then when we lived in Wellington, just in those 5 years when we returned from New Orleans to Wellington, we ended up with like 7 different lads living with us. This one alone ate half a sheep last night. Imagine having 2, 3, 4 of them living with you at any given moment. Sometimes they were there for a month or 2. You get them just about how it works here, and they're gone. And others lived with us for much longer. This is one of those lads there, Reuben, who was the intermediate youth pastor at a church, Anglican church there, and that was the staff team that Jay began doing youth ministry with. Rubes, as he's known, and Rubes calls me Brantley. But you see, that giving to the kingdom is faceless. It's Facebook when I just talk about we had multiple lads live with us. Now, for the women in the room, we're going, where's the young women? I had teenage boys. We're not going there. Those of you who have daughters, that's your game, right? But when you look at that guy, and you look in his eyes, and you see the life, suddenly Reuben has a name, and you get it. Now, this has always been God's people. From the earliest of times, if you have 2 coats, share one. If he asks you to walk a mile, go 2. There's a posture of the simple things of how we're supposed to live, who we're supposed to be. When the plagues hit Rome, it was the church that stayed and cared for them. When Nero, crazy as he was, like watching the headlines now, and he broke out with the persecution against the Jews, it was the Christians who hid them and protected them. As you went on in time and you reach in that first century, it was the Antioch church who cared for the Jerusalem church. It was the Corinthian church who cared for the Antioch church. And on into the future, it was the abbey system that brought about a market economy to improve the lives of subsistence farmers across England. It was the church that invented the idea of hospitals, pragmatic. It was the church that invented the idea of educating ordinary people. It was the church that gave us the model for government that actually cares about the human being and does the social things and tries to be fair and instills the dignity of humanity. The church has always lived in the most pragmatic and real spaces of life. So what do we do with this? By the way, when we were there, the thing that amazed me were the sounds of the bees. The constant buzzing, humming, this cacophony of bees. They actually sounded happy. And they didn't sting me, so life was good. So we've got a church that's been through a desert time. But it's begun to rain. And good things are happening. Shirley, who was in the 9 o'clock, Anthony, who's in the 10:30, working on this food bank system. People around the room who are involved with our ESOL ministry, our youth ministry, our burgeoning children's ministry, mainly music. New people coming every week. There is a life coming. Now, there's a few who have not kept coming. You get used to it. It's what you do for a living. Because when you call people to actually live in a different way, all the way down to the bottom of their soul, their purse, they don't want that. They want Christendom Christianity where they feel good and they feel comfortable to reimagine and redefine the reality of what it is to be a Christ follower, where we follow the rabbi and you read Matthew 25 and you take it for real. But new people come who are moved by that and life is returning. Now, here's where we get real on the money part for today. Three weeks ago, we briefed the church. 8 years of slide, really horrible 2018, in the red, we're still there, we're not back. The thing that happened in both morning teas that day were people approaching the vestry and the wardens and going, wow, we had no idea it was this bad, what do we do? So they bring that to me. I went, probably should have thought of that ahead of time and had that at the time. It leaves them in the crux asking the question until next week. I'm sitting there thinking, we have some widows who don't have two mites to rub together. They can't give another cent. You got some people who can give a lot more. You got some who can give a little more. You got some whose life situation is changing. They can give more. Now, we've got about 400 people in the church. We have 110 giving units. Now, Pat here is a giving unit. One person. But she's also quite retired on a very limited budget. We're a family. We're a unit. Now, we've got 110 giving units out of 400 people, but we actually have about 210 households giving units, which means there's 100 giving units who aren't in the game. And I figured, well, I can't roll all this out. I had Barbara give me some stats, and she's great at doing. And I'm sitting there trying to think, and I was like, no, it ain't going to work. I'm feeling frustrated. Well, it was actually Georgina Ficker's warden who said, why don't you do it this way? And you've seen it in the pew sheet. If we had 100 families give the equivalent, additional to whatever's being given, of one flat white, we would get X amount of dollars. If we had another 110 family units give the equivalent a week, now a family of 4, that's 2 coffees, that's $10. Yeah, not a lot. We could raise this much, and we would almost erase the debt. Here's where I want to challenge us as a church. We got 100 households who aren't giving at all. It's time to move out of the guest room and get your own room and make it home. You're supposed to say that when you're supposed to say it as a Baptist, you're not supposed to say it as an Anglican. I used to be the former and I am the latter. So I'm going to say it. It's time. It's time. If you live in the family, you got to help pay for the sheep you eat. You got to be a part of it. If you're part of the other 110, maybe you can't give more, maybe you can give significantly more, maybe life changes have changed. But the issue is, are we driven by our emotions? Are we still frozen by what took place a few years ago? Or are we going to, with our will and our action in our lives, live in a way that we bring life to our community? If we had, now there's a lot of pretty good teaching. Some of it's done well, some of it's not done bad. I'm not going there. I'm throwing Eric under the bus next week to talk about it. That talks about 10% is probably a good average. Why? Because it's the first fruit and it actually gets above the excess that you would give the guy on the sidewalk as you walk on the footpath past the store, sitting on the cardboard. You throw him a coin or two. It brings to the point of it actually being a little bit of a sacrifice. But if we had the average, which some people can do a lot more, we do more, of $50 a week in this church, and all 210 gave $50 a week, that's $2,600 a year, we would have a giving before our interest income, before the properties, before the book trust and all that, we would have over $500,000 a year coming in. For most people, that's about 1%. That's below the 1% for most people. Our issues would go away tomorrow. We would just be talking about taking ground and planting those sweet desert flowers. When I arrived, I used this metaphor of the cruise ship. That on the cruise ship, most people just gain weight, have to loosen their belt, and by the end of the week, they're over it. They're over all these strangers, they're over the crowds, they're over the touch-and-go tours, they're over being pampered. They just want to go home and eat normal food and sleep in their bed and reestablish their eating and hunger cycle. That's old Christendom. That ship's going to be run up on the beach, and a bunch of barefooted guys operating without health and safety rules, no work safe, are going to cut those rust buckets up and sell them as scrap metal. You ever seen that happen? This is the spirit of New Zealand. This is the church in the 21st century, back on the margins. This is us. The days when we relied on this are done. The scriptural passage to encourage you is that the vine, you have to stay, abide in me, stay plugged in the branches in the vine. The best vine, the best rose bush has to be pruned. The best apple tree has to be pruned. They have to be pruned severely so they can get back to doing what they're doing. Because if a vine gets too long, it no longer grows the grapes. It's too far for the nutrients and the water to flow. It just sucks energy. The tomato plant with the lateral has to be taken out so the energy can go to the tomatoes. The spirit of New Zealand, when you ride that sailing ship, you arrive strangers and you leave with your lifelong friends. You walk down the gangplank of the spirit of New Zealand, not going, I'm over it, I can't wait to get home, and these people are driving me nuts. If I have to see those people from Texas one more time. You walk down this gangplank saying, when can I go again? This is the call I'm calling you to. I've done it before. I've motivated it before. I'm going to show you what it could look like if one community, one church, it's a great little metaphor. It's 40 seconds long. You want to show them that for me? You know who they are, right? The Amish in Pennsylvania? A group of people, each doing what they can. Some young and strong, some elderly and a little more fragile. Each working together, moving this massive barn a long way in 5 minutes. Go home, pull up Google, and do Amish moving barns. That's all you got to do. The whole of this film is 5 minutes long as they move it not just across that road, but uphill in 5 minutes. Imagine this church in 5 minutes, who we could be, where we could go, what we could do. $50 a week. Some can give 400, some can give 10. Each doing what they, you go back to this PowerPoint for me? Can you go back to the same slide, or does it totally take you out? There we go. Go to the second to last one with the photo on it. Just imagine if we could be those people. Dry bones. Allegory? Promise. Possibility? Wild dream. 3 congregations of people, 1 kicking children's ministry, 1 fresh start jump youth ministry, young adults coming together, people from all nations coming into our church. I'm not trying to move you emotionally, because the emotions follow the will. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be also. Amen. I'm going to move this out of the way.